Jack Carter had seen many things in his life: war, loss, the quiet ache of survival. But that winter morning, deep in the frozen woods of Montana, nothing could prepare him for what waited inside that crumbling cabin. A police officer, bound and bloodied, sat slumped against the wall. Beside him, a little girl lay unconscious, her small hand resting against his arm, as if clinging to the last bit of warmth left in the world. The air was still, the silence heavy. Only Rex, Jack's loyal dog, growled low, sensing something far darker than cold or fear. What happened here? And why were they left to die alone in the snow? Stay with me, because what Jack was about to uncover would change everything you think you know about courage, loyalty, and the quiet heroes among us. And before we step into this story, make sure you're subscribed, because some stories are meant to be felt, not just heard. The morning light crept slowly over Winter Hollow, Montana, pale and uncertain, filtered through clouds heavy with frost. Snow blanketed everything, the trees, the ridges, the silence itself, until even the world's edges seemed blurred and distant. The wind carried no birdsong, only the faint whisper of breath freezing in the air. Jack Carter moved steadily through the woods, boots crunching into the white crust beneath his feet. A man in his early 40s, tall and broad-shouldered with short dark brown hair streaked lightly with gray. He carried the weight of quiet years in his gaze. Blue-gray eyes calm yet haunted, the kind that had seen too much and still chose to keep going. His olive-green field jacket was dusted with snow, the collar raised high against the cold, and beneath the brim of a black baseball cap, the word veteran caught a glint of morning light. To him, this forest was both refuge and duty, a place where silence could heal, but also where danger hid easily beneath its stillness. Beside him walked Rex, a 6-year-old German shepherd with a thick coat of black and tan, his gait firm, his head held low as he sniffed the frozen air. Rex was the kind of animal who didn't waste energy on barking without reason. His loyalty was silent, his instincts sharpened by both training and love. The pair had been moving for nearly an hour, checking the old relief shelters built for travelers and hunters who might get caught in the storm. It was something Jack did often, quietly, without anyone asking. The Veterans Hospital had offered him therapy. Instead, he found his peace here, in the sound of snow breaking underfoot, in Rex's steady presence, in the simplicity of doing something that mattered. As they reached the crest of a narrow slope, Rex stopped. The sudden stillness pulled Jack out of his thoughts. The dog's ears perked forward, body tense, nostrils flaring as he growled, low, uncertain, like a whisper from the earth. Jack followed his gaze and saw it. A streak of red, thin at first, then spreading wider against the white, glistening under the faint light like spilled paint. Blood, fresh. The kind that hadn't yet frozen. Jack crouched, gloved hand brushing over it, then looked up toward the direction it trailed, weaving deeper into the forest. "Easy," he murmured to Rex, though his voice was quieter than the wind. The dog's tail lowered, but his eyes stayed locked ahead. They followed the trail in silence. The snow grew deeper, the trees denser, and the faint color of blood guided them like a cruel path. Jack's breath fogged the air in short bursts as he moved cautiously, every sense sharpened. The forest here had a different stillness, not peaceful, but watchful, as though something unseen had only just left. He noticed signs of struggle, broken branches, drag marks half covered in frost, the smear of red against a stone. Whatever had happened here, it wasn't long ago. Rex stopped. Again, ears turning toward a faint creak ahead. Not wind, not animal. Something man-made. Jack stepped forward, pushing past the trees until the shape emerged through the mist, a structure, low and gray, half swallowed by snow. An old concrete cabin, probably built decades ago and forgotten by everyone except time. The door hung slightly open, swinging weakly with the breeze. Jack's fingers tightened around the handle of his knife as he approached. The air changed as he entered, colder somehow, heavy with dampness and rust. Through the cracked walls, thin strips of morning light slipped in, touching the scene inside. It took him a moment to understand what he was seeing. Against the far wall sat a man in a dark blue police jacket, his head slumped forward, his arms twisted painfully behind him, bound tight with several layers of rope that cut deep into his chest and shoulders. His face was swollen and bloodied, one side bruised dark, the other smeared with dried blood. His breath was shallow, barely moving the air. The badge on his arm was still visible, catching the faint light, proof that once he had stood for protection, now reduced to a captive in silence. But what caught Jack's attention next froze him completely. Near the officer's side, curled small against the floor, was a little girl. She couldn't have been more than 8. Her body was thin, frail even under her clothes, a torn brown sweater full of holes, sleeves too long for her small arms. A knitted wool hat, gray and damp from melted snow, barely covered her tangled bright blonde hair. Her cheeks were streaked with dirt, lips pale, and her hands clutched at her chest as if trying to hold on to the last warmth left inside her. She wasn't tied, only unconscious. The sight hit Jack in a way he hadn't expected, not with fear, but with something closer to ache, the same ache that came when he thought of faces he'd lost in places far from home. He stepped forward, slowly, testing the floor for creaks until he reached them. Rex stayed near the doorway, a low growl humming in his throat, his gaze fixed outside as if sensing something unseen. Jack knelt beside the officer first. The ropes were thick, wrapped more times than necessary, the kind used for restraint, not for transport. He pressed 2 fingers against the man's neck. There, faint but steady, still alive. He drew his knife and began sawing through the frozen rope. The fibers resisted, stiff with ice and dried blood, but they eventually gave way. The officer's arms dropped forward, limp. Jack checked his breathing again, still there, though shallow. Then his gaze turned to the child. He reached out and brushed away the strands of hair that clung to her face. Her skin was cold, too cold, and for a heartbeat he feared he was too late. But then he saw it, the faint rise and fall of her chest, the tiny mist of breath leaving her lips. She was alive. Jack exhaled, the sound soft, almost a prayer. "Hang in there, kid," he whispered. Her small hand twitched slightly at the sound, a movement so fragile it broke the silence like glass. He glanced around the room, the cracked window, the overturned chair, the smear of blood along the wall. Whoever had done this hadn't stayed long. Maybe they thought both victims were dead. Maybe they didn't care. Jack didn't have the time to wonder. He slipped his knife back into its sheath and carefully lifted the girl into his arms. She was light, frighteningly light, and her head fell against his chest, the wool of her hat brushing his chin. He wrapped part of his jacket around her before turning back to the officer. "Rex," he said quietly, jerking his head toward the door. The dog responded immediately, stepping outside to keep watch. Jack bent again, heaving the man's weight over his shoulder with a grunt. The walk back through the forest was slow and punishing. The snow, which had seemed calm before, now felt endless. The trail behind them filled almost instantly, as though the forest itself wanted to erase what had happened. Rex led the way, his paws cutting a narrow path, ears flicking with every sound. Jack followed close behind, his breath ragged, each step a battle between strength and exhaustion. The child's faint breathing pressed against his chest, a reminder to keep going. By the time they reached the edge of his small wooden cabin, Jack's muscles burned and his face was numb from the wind. He pushed the door open with his shoulder, stepped inside, and laid the officer carefully on the floor near the stone hearth. The girl he set beside him, close enough for warmth. Rex shook off snow near the door and stood watch, the tip of his tail twitching. Jack knelt, struck a match, and held it to the kindling stacked in the fireplace. It caught slowly, then grew, flames licking the cold air until the room began to glow with orange light. Steam rose from their clothes, and the smell of smoke filled the cabin like an old memory. The firelight touched the girl's face first. Her lashes fluttered, a faint sound caught in her throat, then a soft cough escaped her. Her eyes opened just a sliver, bright blue, lost and glazed, before they closed again. Jack felt something shift inside him, a quiet pull he couldn't name. He turned to the officer, touched the man's wrist once more. The pulse was still weak, but it was there. The snow outside howled against the window, but in here, for the first time that morning, there was life. Jack sat back, hands open near the fire, letting the warmth soak into his skin. He didn't know their names, didn't know what nightmare had led them to that ruin, but as he looked at the pair lying before him, a battered man in uniform, a child too small for the cruelty of this world, he understood one thing with certainty. Something terrible had happened in those woods, and by fate or accident, he was now part of it. Outside, the wind rose again, carrying with it a long, distant echo, not of danger, but of a story just beginning to breathe. Afternoon settled slowly over the mountains, pale and brittle as glass. The fire in the small cabin had burned low, leaving only embers that glowed faintly under a thin veil of smoke. Outside, the wind scraped through the frozen branches like an old whisper, the kind that reminded men how far they were from the rest of the world. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of wood and survival. Jack sat near the hearth, silent, his hands clasped loosely, the heat of the fire painting his face in gold and shadow. Across from him, the man in the dark blue police jacket stirred. A low groan broke the stillness, followed by a ragged breath. The man blinked, eyes unfocused at first, then narrowed as awareness returned, the kind of look born from pain, confusion, and the stubborn instinct to live. He tried to sit up, wincing as the movement sent a jolt through his bruised ribs. Jack moved closer, steadying him without a word. The man's voice came weakly, coarse from cold and blood. "Cole," he murmured, catching his breath. "Cole Matthews, Deputy Sheriff, Pine Ridge County." His words trembled, not from fear, but from exhaustion, the kind that seeps into bone. Jack gave a short nod, not out of politeness but understanding. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was the silence of men who knew what it was to come back from somewhere they shouldn't have survived. Near the corner, the little girl still lay beneath a wool blanket, her small frame rising and falling faintly, the light catching her hair like threads of pale gold. Cole's gaze drifted toward her, and something broke through the hardness of his expression, a flicker of grief. He swallowed, voice rasping. "Her name's Emily," he said softly, as though saying it out loud gave the name weight, reality. She's the reason I was out there." His hands trembled slightly as he reached toward the fire, letting the heat thaw the stiffness from his fingers. We'd been tracking a group for months, a trafficking ring. They moved children across state lines, hide behind charity fronts, church vans, donation drives. No one looks twice when it's wrapped in kindness. His eyes hardened again, focusing on the flames. "I found out too much, tried to pull her out before they moved her. They caught me instead." Jack listened without interrupting. The words carried the heavy rhythm of truth, slow and deliberate, like someone confessing something they'd been forced to carry too long. Rex, lying near the door, raised his head and watched the man carefully, his amber eyes sharp and unreadable. The dog's ears twitched at every sound outside, but he didn't move. Jack leaned back slightly, his face unreadable under the flicker of light, yet his gaze was steady, the kind that invited honesty without demanding it. Cole took another breath, wincing at the pain that crawled up his side. "They tied me up, thought I was dead weight. Emily passed out. Before they did anything worse. When they heard engines in the distance, maybe searchers, maybe nothing, they panicked. Left us both." He closed his eyes briefly, jaw tightening. "If you hadn't come when you did, we'd be gone by now." Jack said nothing. He didn't need to. The quiet between them was the kind that came after battles, where words could do nothing that presence hadn't already done. He looked at the girl again, at her small hand peeking out from the blanket, and something in his chest ached. Not pity, something deeper, older, maybe because she reminded him of all the innocence the world seemed too eager to destroy. Outside, the wind shifted direction, pushing against the walls of the cabin with a hollow groan. The temperature was dropping again, and with it came the instinctual tightening in Jack's chest, a warning from years of knowing when calm wasn't safety, but the pause before something worse. Rex rose to his feet suddenly, moving closer to the door, muscles taut beneath his coat. His tail stiffened, and a low growl rumbled through his chest, not loud, but certain. Jack's head lifted immediately. He glanced toward the small window. Just enough light remained to see faint shadows moving between the trees. Not the wind, not deer. Too steady. Too deliberate. His instincts tightened. "Someone's out there," Jack said quietly, not asking, just stating. Cole struggled to push himself up, his hand instinctively reaching toward his belt, though the weapon was long gone. "They'll come back," he muttered, voice hoarse but certain. "They don't leave loose ends." Jack's expression hardened. He moved to the fire, crouched, and pressed the heel of his hand over the burning log, smothering it with ash and a wet cloth until the glow died down. The room fell into darkness, broken only by the dim light from the window. He motioned to Cole to stay low and placed a hand lightly on Rex's neck, signaling silence. The dog froze instantly, only his breathing visible in small bursts of mist. Outside, the crunch of snow grew clearer. Footsteps, not many, maybe two, circling the perimeter. Then the sound of a vehicle idling in the distance, an engine humming low, muffled by wind and snow. The air thickened. Every creak of the wood felt amplified. Cole's breathing came shallow, labored. Emily stirred faintly but didn't wake. Jack crouched near the door, peering through a narrow gap in the curtain. He could make out faint shapes moving beyond the tree line. Flashes of movement, the glint of metal in a hand, the faint red glow of a cigarette ember. He'd seen men like that before, patient, trained, not reckless. Whoever they weren't there by chance. He turned his head slightly toward Cole. "They're watching," he whispered. Cole nodded, his expression grim. "They'll wait for dark," he replied under his breath. "They think no one knows. They're there." Minutes dragged into something longer, quieter, until the sounds began to fade. The footsteps retreated, slow and deliberate, crunching through the snow until only the whisper of wind remained. The distant engine rumbled once, then died. Silence reclaimed the woods. Jack didn't move for a while, only listening, the way soldiers do when they know silence can lie. Then he eased back, letting out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Rex stayed at the door, still alert, eyes fixed on the trees. Cole leaned against the wall, the exhaustion washing over him again. "They know where we are," he said softly, almost to himself. Jack gave a single nod. "Then we stay quiet," he replied, his voice calm but deliberate. He glanced toward the little girl, her breathing steady now under the blanket, unaware of the danger breathing just outside her safety. For a long while, none of them spoke. The wind moved gently against the window, and somewhere far off, the faint sound of tires rolling over ice echoed once before vanishing into the distance. Jack finally stood, moving to the small window again. The forest beyond was empty, but the kind of empty that watches back. He closed the curtain and sat down near the fire pit, now only a circle of gray ash. The light that filtered through the cracks in the wall was weak and silver, marking the slow crawl of evening. Inside, the air was still, yet every breath carried the weight of knowing they'd been seen. Cole rested his head back against the wall, eyes half closed, and said quietly, "You didn't ask who they are." Jack's gaze didn't leave the window. "Doesn't matter tonight," he said. The words were simple, but in them was the understanding of a man who had spent too long learning when to wait, when to move, and when to stay silent. Outside, the last light drained from the snow, leaving only gray shadows and the sound of the wind folding around the cabin. Inside, 3 people and a dog sat still, bound not by fear, but by a shared awareness that survival sometimes begins with silence. The world beyond those walls might have been vast, violent, or cruel, but for now, the flicker of breath and the faint rhythm of life inside that small cabin were all that mattered. The sun climbed over Winter Hollow in a pale shimmer, its light weak against the endless white. The storm had passed, leaving the world still and brittle, coated in silence. Smoke rose faintly from the chimney of Jack's cabin, a thin gray thread against the frozen air. Inside, the fire crackled low, filling the small room with an amber glow that touched the faces of the 3 souls gathered around it. Jack sat on the floor beside the hearth, tightening the strap of his boots, his gaze fixed quietly on the embers. Cole Matthews leaned back against the wall, his face pale but awake now, one hand wrapped around a tin mug that steamed faintly. Emily still slept, curled beneath a wool blanket near Rex, who lay watchful beside her, head resting on his paws, his golden eyes alert even in rest. The morning had been slow, the kind where thoughts grew louder than voices. When Cole finally spoke, his words were rough, careful, as though each one cost him effort. "There's something I didn't tell you last night," he said, staring into the fire instead of at Jack. "The drive, the USB, it has everything. The kids, the names, the roots. It's proof." His breath came unsteady as he lifted his gaze. But I dropped it back there in that damn cabin. If we don't have it, the feds won't believe a word of this." The sentence hung between them, heavy as the frost outside. Jack didn't move for a while. His jaw tightened, and when he finally spoke, his voice was low, practical. "Then we go get it." Cole shook his head slightly. "It's not that simple. If Hale's men find it first, they'll bury it for good." Jack rose slowly, slipping on his coat, the same olive-green jacket frayed at the seams, and pulled his black cap lower against the light. He didn't ask who Hale was. He could see the name carried a weight in Cole's expression that said enough. "Rest," he said quietly. "I'll bring it back." Rex was already on his feet, tail stiff, reading his master's intent before any words were spoken. Cole opened his mouth to protest, but stopped when he saw Jack's eyes, steady, unflinching, the eyes of a man who had long made peace with risk. The sound of the wind followed Jack out the door, and then there was only silence and the fading echo of boots crunching over the snow. The trail was faint now, blurred by the night's frost, but Rex had no trouble finding it. The dog's nose hovered close to the ground, weaving between the trees with the precision of instinct. The forest was different in daylight, calmer, yet lonelier. Each tree stood like a sentry, each shadow carrying its own echo. Jack moved quietly, following the blood trail until it faded into the clearing where the old concrete house waited, half buried beneath snowdrifts. The place looked even smaller now, more like a wound in the landscape than a shelter. He paused at the edge of the clearing, his breath visible in the cold air. Then advanced, one slow step at a time. The inside of the cabin was colder than he remembered. Frost clung to the walls, and the air smelled faintly of smoke and metal. The ropes he had cut the day before still lay on the floor, stiff with blood. Rex circled the room once, nose twitching, then growled low, eyes fixed on the far corner. Jack followed the gaze and saw it, a dent in the snow near the wall, the faint mark of tire tracks just outside the cracked door. He crouched to look closer, pressing a gloved hand into one of the impressions, fresh. The edges hadn't yet crusted over with ice. Someone had been here this morning. He rose, scanning the floor, and that's when his eyes caught something glinting beneath the broken shelf. A wrench, heavy and clean, its handle engraved with a small marking, R. Hale. He turned the tool over slowly in his hand, the letters biting into the metal like a signature of guilt. The name struck something in his mind. Hale, the Pine Ridge police chief Cole had spoken of with quiet contempt. Jack's expression hardened. It wasn't surprise, just confirmation of the ugliness he had already suspected. "You son of a bitch," he muttered under his breath, setting the wrench down carefully. Then he looked back at Rex, who had begun pawing at something near a stack of rusted cans in the corner. The dog whined once, sharply. Jack stepped closer, crouched, and pushed aside the debris. Beneath a half-crushed tin, a small metal container lay wedged into the floor. He pried it open. Inside, wrapped in a torn piece of cloth, was a USB drive. Cold, scratched but intact. He let out a slow exhale. "Good boy," he said softly. But the quiet didn't last. The sound came faint at first, a low mechanical hum carried on the wind, distant but growing. An engine. Jack froze, listening. Then he heard the crunch of tires over snow. He turned his head toward the doorway just as a shadow moved across the frame. A man stepped into view, tall, heavy-set, wearing a dark parka with the hood pulled low, a rifle slung over his shoulder. His beard was short, his jaw tense, and his eyes sharp with the cold focus of someone who didn't come to talk. Jack's mind measured distance, angles, possibilities, old habits that had never really left. The man's voice cut through the silence, rough and steady. "You shouldn't be here." Jack didn't answer. He shifted his stance slightly, hand near his belt. Rex stood beside him, hackles raised, a deep growl vibrating through his chest. The stranger lifted his rifle, not fully, but enough. "Step away," he said. "That drive isn't yours." Jack's breath came out slow, his tone even. "And it's not yours either." The moment stretched, long, thin, and dangerous. Then the man moved first. A twitch of muscle, a shift of weight, enough to break the balance. Rex lunged. The explosion of movement shattered the stillness. The dog hit the man square in the chest, the rifle jerking upward as it fired into the ceiling. Jack closed the distance, grabbed the weapon, and twisted. The man shouted, the sound muffled by the snow and the snarl of Rex's growl. They hit the floor hard, the fight short but brutal, ending when Jack's elbow connected with the man's jaw. He lay still, groaning, blood pooling in the snow beside his head. Rex stepped back, panting, fur bristled. Jack stood over the man for a moment, catching his breath. His pulse was steady again, controlled. Then he picked up the USB, wiped it clean on his glove, and slipped it into his pocket. The walk back felt longer. The wind had picked up, carrying with it the faint hum of an engine fading somewhere down the valley, maybe the man's backup, maybe no one at all. Rex stayed close, his pace quick, ears turning with every sound. By the time the cabin came into view again, the light had shifted to gray, the kind that signaled another storm waiting behind the ridge. Jack pushed the door open and stepped inside. Cole looked up from the chair near the fire, relief flickering across his face when he saw what Jack held. "You found it," he said, his voice rough but alive. Jack handed him the drive, wordless. Cole plugged it into the old laptop resting on the table. The screen flickered, then filled with names, photographs, and files. 32 children, each one marked with medical records, pickup routes, and coded transfers between states. The air in the cabin seemed to freeze again, not from cold but from the weight of truth. Cole's jaw tightened. "God help us," he whispered. Jack stood behind him, the light from the screen reflecting in his eyes, steady and grim. Outside, the snow began to fall again, quiet and endless, covering the tracks of everything except what couldn't be buried, the proof of what men had done and what others would now have to face. The day faded under a dim, colorless sky, leaving Winter Hollow wrapped in the stillness before a storm. Inside the cabin, the glow from the fire played gently across worn faces, flickering against the walls like restless ghosts. The air was heavy, dense with the unspoken weight of what they had seen on the screen. 32 names, 32 faces, each one proof of how deep the rot had gone. Cole Matthews sat quietly at the wooden table, his jaw tight, the lines around his eyes hardened by disbelief and fury. When his gaze met Jack's, it wasn't surprise that lingered there. It was recognition, the same weary understanding of men who had both witnessed betrayal too close to home. Cole's hand trembled as he scrolled to the last entry. The initials on the authorization file were unmistakable. R. Hale. He leaned back, breath shallow. "Robert Hale," he said, the name breaking the silence like the crack of wood in the fire. "Chief of Pine Ridge Police. He sold the investigation to the same people we were chasing." His voice was low, steady, but carried the quiet devastation of a man realizing the war had been inside his own walls. The room seemed smaller now, the firelight colder. Jack didn't answer right away. He looked toward the frosted window, where the snow had begun to drift sideways, carried by the wind. When he finally spoke, his voice carried that calm certainty of someone who no longer believed in luck. "Then he'll come for it. Tonight, maybe sooner." Cole's nod was slow but certain. There was no need for argument. Men like Hale didn't leave loose ends. Jack moved to the radio set sitting on the counter, the old kind with a cracked dial and a humming static that seemed older than the cabin itself. He turned the knobs carefully, finding a faint signal that hissed between frequencies. "Logan," he murmured, leaning close to the receiver, "you better still be listening." The voice that answered came faint, broken through interference. Logan Pierce, a federal agent in his 40s, once Jack's partner in a long-forgotten rescue unit. The sound of him brought back an entire decade in one breath. Dust, fire, loss. "Jack, signal's weak. You're not supposed to be on this channel." Jack's voice stayed calm. "We've got proof. Trafficking, law enforcement cover. Hale's at the top. Need extraction. Coordinates incoming." There was a pause, a crackle of static. "Send the beacon. Satellite link will try to lock, but the snow's thick. You'll have to keep it active manually." Jack looked at the flickering lantern, then back toward Cole. "We just need a few hours," he said quietly, almost to himself. Evening turned to night without transition, just a slow dimming until the forest outside became a wall of black. The wind grew heavier, carrying flurries of snow that slapped against the cabin like whispers from the dark. Inside, Emily sat on the floor near Rex, tracing circles in the frost with her finger. Her wool hat drooped over one eye, and her small face looked paler in the firelight, the exhaustion of fear settling deep. Rex lay beside her, his body warm, his head resting protectively against her shoulder. The dog's ears flicked toward every noise, the creak of the roof, the whistle of wind, never resting. Jack adjusted the beam of his flashlight, checking the battery of the locator he'd set on the table. Its faint green light blinked weakly, each flash fighting to stay alive through the static. Cole reloaded his sidearm with steady hands, his movements precise despite the fatigue. The silence between them wasn't fear. It was readiness. Then Rex lifted his head, ears pricked, a low growl rolling from deep in his chest. Jack froze. Outside, faint but certain, came the rumble of engines, more than one closing in. The hum grew louder, joined by the crunch of boots over snow. Cole reached for the rifle near the window, his breath tightening. They found us. Jack didn't answer. His focus had already narrowed. Through the narrow slit of the shutter, he saw flashes of movement, men spreading out, rifles slung across their shoulders, flashlights cutting through the storm. And at the center of it, stepping from a dark SUV, was Robert Hale. He was a man in his 50s, broad-shouldered, with the kind of authority that came from years of wearing a badge that no longer meant justice. His gray hair was slicked back beneath a fur-lined coat, and the reflection of firelight from a flare gun painted his face in red and shadow. When he spoke, it was almost polite. "Jack Carter," his voice carried over the snow, calm and measured. "You've got something that doesn't belong to you." Jack stayed behind the curtain, eyes steady. Hale's tone hardened. "Come out. Bring the drive and the girl. Walk away alive." Then the sound of a match being struck, a single spark, before the flare hissed through the air and landed in the snow. A second later, the edges of the forest erupted in flame. The orange glow swallowed the dark, painting the trees in dancing firelight. Smoke curled into the air, sharp and fast, spreading like breath from a monster. Cole moved to the back door, his jaw clenched. "They're hurting us," he said. Jack nodded once. "Then we don't run. Not yet." He turned to Emily, his voice low but firm. "In the cabinet, stay quiet, no matter what you hear." The girl nodded, eyes wide, trembling but obedient. Rex followed her, nosing the door shut once she crawled inside. The wind howled, the heat from outside seeping through the walls. Jack checked the rifle's chamber, then met Cole's eyes. There was no speech, no promise, just a mutual understanding between two men who had both run out of chances before. The first shot broke the night like thunder. The window shattered inward, glass scattering across the floor. Jack ducked, fired once in return. Zri, the sound deafening in the small room. Outside, shouts echoed through the blaze, figures moving between shadows. Rex barked sharply, warning as a second shot tore through the wall. Cole pressed against the doorway, returning fire in controlled bursts. The storm and the gunfire merged into chaos, the hiss of snow, the crack of bullets, the low roar of flames surrounding the cabin. Smoke filled the air, thick and biting. Emily, hidden behind the cabinet door, covered her ears, tears streaming silently as the light of the fire flickered through the cracks like the world was breaking apart. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Then, the door gave way under a heavy kick, splintering inward. Hale stepped through first, his gun raised, face illuminated by the fire behind him. His eyes met Jack's, calm, certain, the look of a man who believed the world still answered to him. "You should have stayed out of this," he said. Jack didn't reply. Rex moved first, bursting from the corner in a blur of fur and fury. The impact knocked one of Hale's men off balance, sending the rifle spinning. Cole shouted, firing once, striking another attacker who had rushed the doorway. Jack used the moment, lunging forward, his shoulders slamming into Hale's chest. They hit the floor, the gun skidding across the boards. For a second, the world was only sound. The fire crackling, the struggle, the low growl of a dog fighting to protect his own. Hale swung, catching Jack across the jaw, but Jack didn't stop. He drove forward, the years of training turning into instinct. A moment later, the fight ended, with Hale pinned against the floor, the weight of Jack's forearm across his throat. His breath came harsh and short, the arrogance fading from his eyes, replaced by something smaller: fear. Jack didn't say a word. Behind him, Cole was dragging himself toward the back, shouting over the roar of the flames. "We have to move! The fire's spreading!" Jack hesitated just long enough to pull the locator from the table, then rose, leaving Hale gasping on the ground. The back door burst open under the wind's force, the cold rushing in like salvation. Snow whipped through the smoke, biting at their faces. Rex barked, circling behind them as they stumbled out into the night, the forest now half lit by flame. The storm had begun to rise again, snow swirling thick and fast, extinguishing the fire's edges as they climbed the ridge behind the cabin. Jack stopped once, turning back to see the cabin's roof collapse inward, sparks flying up into the dark sky. Cole staggered beside him, clutching his shoulder. "You got the beacon?" Jack nodded, pressing the small device against his chest. Its light flickered weakly, a pulse, faint but alive. "We'll make it work," he said quietly, the words almost swallowed by the wind. The three figures, man, wounded lawman, and loyal dog, disappeared into the snow, their silhouettes swallowed by the storm. Behind them, the blaze hissed and died, leaving only smoke curling into the night sky, a signal, a warning, and a promise that the fight was not yet over. The night had barely given way when the first sound cut through the storm, the distant thrum of rotor blades slicing the heavy air. Snow swirled violently around the ridge, wind screaming across the mountain face, but through the chaos the sound grew clearer, closer, pulsing like a heartbeat from the sky. Jack stood knee-deep in snow, one arm shielding his face, the other gripping the signal beacon that blinked faintly against the blizzard's fury. Cole knelt nearby, pale from blood loss, his shoulder bandaged in layers of torn fabric. Rex stood beside Jack, fur matted with ice, his amber eyes fixed on the horizon, barking once sharply as if urging the heavens to hurry. Above them, a beam of light broke through the snow. The federal rescue helicopter had found them. The descent was rough. The aircraft shuddered against the wind, searchlight cutting arcs across the mountain slope. Through the headset, Jack could hear Logan Pierce's voice, calm but urgent, guiding the pilot down. "Hold steady. I've got your beacon, 15 meters north." The helicopter hovered low enough to send waves of snow spiraling outward. Agents in dark parkas jumped out, weapons drawn, their steps fast and efficient. Within minutes, the mountainside filled with motion, the sound of orders shouted through the storm, the metallic click of restraints, the crackle of radios. Far below, where the fire still smoldered in the valley, Robert Hale and his remaining men were surrounded, forced to their knees under the blinding light of the helicopter. Justice had finally found them, not with glory, but inevitability. Cole was lifted onto a stretcher, his face pale yet calm, one hand gripping Jack's wrist before they took him aboard. "You got us home," he said weakly, his breath visible in the freezing air. Jack didn't reply. He only squeezed his friend's shoulder once, firm, steady, the kind of gesture that carried everything words couldn't. Rex paced beside them, restless, until Jack whistled low and the dog settled, eyes never leaving Cole until the cabin door shut. In the distance, Hale was being led into custody, his once-polished badge hanging askew on his torn coat, his expression unreadable, trapped between rage and disbelief. The snow swallowed the noise of his protests, leaving only the faint hum of blades overhead and the sigh of the storm easing at last. When dawn came, the mountain looked different, softer, almost kind. The federal team cleared the site, gathering evidence, marking the perimeter where the last embers of the fire smoldered against the snow. Emily had been taken aboard the second chopper, wrapped in a thermal blanket, her small hand gripping Rex's collar until the last moment. She watched from the window as the forest fell away beneath her, white, endless, but no longer frightening. Jack stood alone near the ridge, the morning light painting his face in shades of pale gold. For the first time in days, there was no gunfire, no shouting, only the quiet hum of wind moving through the trees. Weeks passed like melted snow running down stone, quietly, without drama. The case spread across headlines, statewide trafficking network dismantled, police chief among those arrested. Dozens of missing children were found across multiple states, brought home to families who had never stopped waiting. The USB Jack recovered had become the key to everything: names, routes, payments, the thread that unraveled an empire built on silence. Yet for Jack, the noise of it, the interviews, the cameras, the commendations, meant little. When the official letter arrived offering him a civilian Medal of Honor, he declined. The words he gave were simple, almost quiet. "I'm not a hero. I just couldn't stand still while evil stood right in front of me." Logan Pierce called once more from Washington, his voice half proud, half tired. "You did good work out there, Jack. We could use men like you again." Jack smiled faintly, though Logan couldn't see it. "You've got plenty of men like me," he replied, his tone gentle but firm. "What you need are men who still believe the world can be better." The line went silent for a moment, not disagreement, just understanding. They both knew that wars came in different forms, and some never truly ended. They only changed their scenery. Cole healed slower than expected. His shoulder bore a scar that would never fade, a reminder of the night he almost lost everything he believed in. But he didn't go back to the department. Instead, he filed his resignation, and within a month, a small wooden sign appeared at the edge of Pine Valley. Winter Light Shelter, a safe place for every child. The building stood modestly, surrounded by pine and snow, its windows glowing warm in the cold. Children began to arrive, quiet, broken at first, and under Cole's care, they started to heal. He walked slower now, but there was peace in his steps. Jack visited often, though he never announced his arrival. Sometimes he brought supplies, sometimes just Rex, whose presence alone made the children laugh. He'd stand in the courtyard, showing them how to hold their ground, how to listen to the world around them. Lessons not from war, but from life. "Trust your instincts," he'd tell them softly. "And if you ever get lost, look for the loyal ones. They'll guide you home." Rex would sit beside him, tail thumping in the snow, his amber eyes gentle as the children patted his fur. Emily lived there too for a while, under Cole's guardianship. The girl who once trembled in the dark now laughed easily, her blonde hair catching the light each time she ran across the yard. Her coat was new, pink and warm, and though her steps were still uneven from the cold, she ran with more heart than anyone around her. Rex followed her faithfully, matching her pace, his breath visible in little clouds of joy. Sometimes when she fell, he'd nudge her gently back to her feet, waiting until she smiled again. One morning, as the first light spilled across the valley, Jack arrived early. The air was sharp, clean, filled with the sound of children's laughter echoing through the trees. He stood near the fence, hands in his jacket pockets, watching Emily toss a snowball toward Rex. The dog leapt high, catching it mid-air before it burst apart in a glitter of white. She laughed, bright and pure, a sound that seemed to lift the frost right off the ground. Jack smiled faintly, the kind of smile that came not from happiness alone, but from something deeper: relief, gratitude, peace. The sun rose higher, warming the frozen field. Cole stepped out from the sheltered doorway, waving once toward Jack before turning back to guide the children inside for breakfast. Jack stayed where he was, watching until the laughter faded into the hum of morning. Then he turned toward the horizon, where the forest stretched endlessly, silent and white. Rex trotted back to his side, sitting close, pressing his head lightly against Jack's hand. The man rested his palm on the dog's neck, looking out at the light spreading over Winter Hollow, the kind of light that promised renewal. The snow sparkled beneath the dawn, and for the first time in a long while, Jack didn't think about the past or what was lost. He only thought of what had been saved: a girl, a friend, and maybe, in some quiet way, himself. Sometimes the quietest stories are the ones that stay with us the longest, not because they are loud or heroic, but because they remind us that goodness still exists, in the small hands that reach out, in the loyal hearts that never turn away, and in those who choose kindness even when no one is watching. There are people who walk through this world without medals or names in the paper, yet their courage holds it together in ways we may never see. And maybe that's what faith really means, to believe that even in the coldest places, light still finds a way through. If this story has touched you, share it with someone who still believes in compassion, leave a thought below, and subscribe to keep these moments alive. May God bless those who keep loving, even when the world forgets to notice.